The wind in the Arizona territory had a name and a color. It was the red wind, and it blew from the east, carrying the dust of the high plateau across the cracked earth until everything, from the hides of the longhorn cattle to the souls of the men who drove them, was stained a faint, weary rose. It was a wind that promised no rain, only a dry chafing of the spirit and a constant thirst. The town of Dry Creek had learned to lean into it, its few dozen buildings huddled together as if for warmth, pressed against a cattle trail that was the town's artery and a stagecoach line that was its nervous system, pumping mail and railroad wages through the dust. In the heart of that dust, inside the swinging doors of the Ruby Jack Saloon, Molly O'Rourke commanded her own small kingdom of heat and steam. Her domain was a long kitchen smelling of frying bacon, boiling coffee, and the sharp, clean scent of the onions she chopped with a speed that blurred her hands. She was the best cook in Dry Creek, which was like being the tallest tree in a petrified forest. It was a fact, plain and simple, and she wielded it like the heavy cast-iron skillet she could swing with one arm. Her hair was the color of a sunset that had given up, a messy bun of reddish-brown that was always escaping its pins. Her mouth was quick with a retort, but her heart was a soft, foolish thing that often got her into trouble. She fed stray dogs, gave miners credit they would never repay, and once patched up a card-sharp shoulder with her own good linen. Her goal was a simple one: to save enough money to buy the abandoned diner at the end of the street and run a place where the food was honest, even if the customers were not. She called it living respectably. Tonight, the kitchen was hotter than usual. A trio of drovers, flush with trail pay, kept ordering steaks, and the air was thick with the hiss of beef on hot iron. Molly worked, her movements economical and sure. Tucked into the worn leather belt at her waist was a small, sharp knife, its handle worn smooth from use. It was a paring knife, a tool of her trade, but it was also a promise to herself, a promise that she would carve her own way, and if anyone tried to stop her, they would find the blade was not just for peeling potatoes. Outside, leaning against the sun-warmed adobe wall of the general store, Atsidinez watched the town breathe. He was a man made of the long shadows and quiet patience of the land itself. Tall and lean, he moved with a stillness that could be mistaken for lethargy by those who did not know better. His face was a map of sun and wind, his eyes holding the deep, calm clarity of a desert sky after a storm. He had once been a scout for the army, a life that had taught him much about the ways of the white man and even more about the ache of his own people's honor. Now he hired himself out as a guide, his knowledge of the canyons and mesas a valuable commodity. He was in Dry Creek to finalize a contract to guide a wagon train of indigo dyes to the next territory, a job that would bring him closer to his real purpose, earning enough to buy back the flock of sheep his family had lost to the last drought. He felt the pull of his kin near Canyon de Chelly, a steady, grounding force in a world that seemed determined to spin off its axis. He did not belong here, in this town of loud noises and cheap whiskey, but it was a necessary stop on his path, a path of duty. Later, the red wind died down, and a strange, quiet rain began to fall. It was not a real rain, but a fine mist that hung in the air, turning the dust to a thin, slick mud without ever truly washing it away. Molly, finished with the last of the supper orders, stepped out the back door of the kitchen for a breath of cool air. The alley smelled of stale beer and wet dirt. She was about to turn back inside when she heard voices from the far end, near the livery stable, low and urgent. Curiosity was another of her weaknesses. She flattened herself against the rough wooden wall of the saloon, the mist cool on her cheeks. Two figures stood in the weak lantern light spilling from the stable doorway. One was Silas Boone, the man who owned the largest ranch in the county and half the businesses in Dry Creek. He was a big man who filled his fine clothes, his voice a low rumble of authority. The other was a leaner, meaner shape, a man named Hollis Tate. Tate had the dead eyes and quick hands of a man who had done bad things for pay, a reputation he had earned during a short, ugly career with the Pinkerton Agency. "The whole payroll is in the coach," Tate was saying, his voice a dry rasp. They think sending it on the mail run is clever. It will not be. See that it is not. Boone rumbled. He held up a silver cigarette lighter, its surface intricately engraved. He flicked it open, the flame flaring up for a moment, illuminating his satisfied smile. There will be a significant bonus if this is handled cleanly. No witnesses. As Boone snapped the lighter shut, a loose floorboard on the saloon's back porch groaned under Molly's foot. It was a small sound, but in the damp quiet, it was as loud as a gunshot. Both men froze, their heads snapping in her direction. Molly's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw the glint of Boone's silver lighter and the cold recognition in Hollis Tate's eyes. They had seen her. She did not wait. She scrambled back into the kitchen, her breath catching in her throat, the heavy door swinging shut behind her. The next morning, the sun burned away the mist, and the town returned to its usual routine of sweat and commerce. Molly was serving breakfast, her hands steady but her mind racing. She had not slept. The image of Tate's face burned into her memory. She was pouring coffee for a table of miners when the first man groaned. He was a big, beefy man who worked one of Boone's claims. He clutched his stomach, his face turning a sickly shade of green. A moment later, another man at a different table doubled over, coughing violently. Panic spread through the saloon like a brush fire. Within minutes, half a dozen men were groaning, claiming their food was poisoned. Then Silas Boone appeared, his face a mask of civic concern. He moved among the sick men, his voice booming over the rising clamor. "What has this woman done?" he bellowed, pointing a thick finger at Molly, who stood frozen behind the counter, a coffee pot still in her hand. "These are good, hard-working men. And she has fed them poison, that is a lie," Molly said, her voice shaking but clear. "The food is fresh. I made it myself this morning. She is trying to kill us all," someone shouted from the crowd that was now spilling in from the street. Hollis Tate stood near the back, his arms crossed, a thin, cruel smile on his lips. "There is only one cure for a poisoner," Boone declared, his voice ringing with false righteousness. "A rope." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. The crowd surged forward, their faces a blur of anger and fear. They were not thinking. They were a beast, and Boone was its master. They lunged for her, knocking over tables and chairs. Molly backed away, her hand instinctively going to the small knife at her belt. It would be useless against so many. Atsidi Nez had been standing across the street, watching the scene unfold. He had seen the whole performance, from the first man's theatrical groan to Boone's practiced outrage. He saw the lie in it, as clear as the lay of the land. He saw Hollis Tate's smug satisfaction, and he saw the woman, cornered and alone, her back against the wall, her expression not of fear, but of fierce, defiant anger. It was not his fight. His contract was waiting. His sheep were waiting. Getting involved in the white man's messy justice was a fool's errand, but his honor was not a coat he could take off when it became inconvenient. He had seen men like Boone before, men who used fear to twist the truth into a weapon. He would not stand by and watch it happen. Not again. He moved, not with a rush, but with a deliberate, flowing grace that ate up the distance to the saloon. He entered not through the front, but through the side door, slipping through the chaos unnoticed. The mob was closing in on Molly, their hands reaching for her. Nez grabbed a heavy whiskey bottle from a nearby table. With a flick of his wrist, he sent it crashing into the large mirror behind the bar. The sound of shattering glass was explosive, a sharp crack that momentarily stunned the crowd. Every head turned. In that instant of shocked silence, Nez was beside Molly. He did not speak. He simply took her arm, his grip firm but not rough. He pulled her toward the back of the saloon, away from the stunned faces. "What are you doing?" she gasped, stumbling to keep up. "Living," he said, his voice a low calm in the storm. He kicked open the kitchen door they had come through and pulled her into the alley. His horse, a sturdy buckskin, was tied to a hitching post nearby. In one smooth motion, he untied the reins and swung himself into the saddle. He reached down a hand for her. "Come," he said. It was not a request. She did not hesitate. She took his hand, and he pulled her up behind him, her skirts tangling around his legs. The shouts from the saloon were growing louder now, the beast rousing from its confusion. Nez spurred the horse, and they clattered out of the alley and onto the main street. Men poured out of the saloon, their faces contorted with rage, some of them reaching for their pistols. Nez did not look back. He urged the horse into a gallop, the animal's powerful legs churning through the red dust. They thundered past the general store, past the blacksmith's shop, and out of the town limits, leaving the shouts and the false accusations to be swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. The fine mist of the night before had returned, clinging to them as they rode, blurring the line between the red earth and the gray sky. Molly held on tight, her cheek pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, a calm rhythm against the frantic pounding of her own. She was free, but she was a fugitive. She had been saved by a stranger who spoke in single words, a man as quiet and unreadable as the stone canyons that now rose up around them. "They will follow," she said, her voice muffled against his back. He did not turn. He just kept his eyes on the trail ahead, a faint path winding into the wilderness. "Yes," Atsidi Nez said, as the mist began to feel like rain. "Let them." The buckskin moved with a steady, ground-eating rhythm, its hooves making a soft, rhythmic drumming against the packed earth. They rode into the throat of a box canyon, the towering walls of red rock rising on either side, swallowing the sky until only a narrow ribbon of bruised purple remained above them. The air grew cooler, trapped in the deep shadows. The shouting from Dry Creek had long since faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind moving through the sparse, hardy brush that clung to the canyon floor. Molly O'Rourke held onto the man in front of her, her fingers hooked into his belt. Her initial terror had subsided, replaced by a cold, simmering anger and 1,000 questions that were buzzing in her head like trapped flies. The man, this Atsidi Nez, had not said more than 5 words to her since pulling her onto his horse. He rode with an unnerving stillness, his back straight, his shoulders relaxed, a part of the horse and the landscape. After what felt like an hour, he finally drew the horse to a halt in a small alcove where a seep of water darkened the rock face and fed a patch of stubborn green grass. He slid from the saddle with fluid ease. He did not offer to help her. He simply waited. Molly, stiff and sore, managed to slide down, her legs nearly buckling when her boots hit the ground. She watched as he loosened the cinch on his saddle and let the horse drink sparingly from the shallow pool of water. He moved with an economy of motion that was both frustrating and fascinating. Every action had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. "You are as talkative as a boulder," she finally said, the words sharp with nervous energy. Her voice echoed slightly against the stone. He looked at her, his dark eyes calm and unreadable. He considered her statement as if it were a rock he was examining for flaws. "Boulders last long," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough but not unkind. She gave a short, exasperated laugh. "Is that what you are planning on doing? Lasting long because those men back there are not going to just give up?" "No," he agreed. He took a canteen from his saddle horn, uncorked it, and drank. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before offering it to her. "They will not." She took the canteen, the metal cool against her palms. The water was clean, with a faint, minty aftertaste she could not place. "So what is your plan, Mr. Boulder, or should I call you Mr.? Nez will do," he said, turning his attention back to his horse. "Checking a shoe. The plan is to get you away from them." "That is a fine start," Molly admitted, taking another sip of the strange, refreshing water. "But what about the finish? I cannot just run forever. That man, Silas Boone, he framed me. He accused me of poisoning people. My name is all I have. Well, my name and a skillet I'm very fond of that I had to leave behind. I have to go back. I have to clear my name." She thought of her dream, the little diner, the respectable life she was trying to build. and a fresh wave of anger washed over her. She would not let a man like Boone take that from her. Nez finished with the horse and finally gave her his full attention. "You will not go back to Dry Creek," he stated. It was not a suggestion. Not now. Boone owns the law there. You saw it. The town wanted a rope, not a trial. Then what, she demanded, her hands on her hips. "We ride through this desert until we fall over from the Heat Pine Mesa." He said, "It is a 2-day ride. There is a man there, Reverend Miller. He is a good man, an honest one. I will leave you with him. He will see you get to a real court, somewhere Boone cannot buy the judge." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the canyon rim. "Then I go my own way. I have a job, people I am responsible for." The finality in his tone rankled her. She was a problem to be delivered and discarded, a piece of troublesome baggage. It was a feeling she was used to, but one she hated. She had been taking care of herself since she was a girl, arriving from Ireland with nothing but a thick accent and a recipe for soda bread from her mother. The shame of that poverty was a ghost that still walked with her, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, stubborn pride in the life she had forged with her own 2 hands. "Just like that," she said, her voice flat. "You drop me off at a church like an unwanted kitten and ride off to collect your wages." "It is the safest way," he replied, his expression unchanging. He was not being cruel. He was being practical. And that, somehow, was worse. It meant he was not considering her as a person, but as a situation to be managed. They rode on. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the red rock until the heat radiated invisible waves. The narrow canyon opened into a wide, sun-blasted plain dotted with sagebrush and skeletal-looking juniper trees. The world was a canvas of brown, red, and a blinding blue sky. Molly felt her skin begin to prickle and burn. The fine mist had long since evaporated, leaving a dry, punishing heat in its wake. She saw Nez watching her in a peripheral way. He rode slightly ahead, but she knew his attention was divided between the trail ahead and her. He saw her shielding her face with her hand, saw the flush rising on her cheeks. Without a word, he reined in his horse, took the canteen from his saddle, and passed it back to her again. "Drink," he said, "and put some on your face." She did as she was told, splashing the cool, herb-infused water onto her skin. It was instantly soothing. "What is in this?" she asked, looking at the plain metal canteen. "Leaves," he said. "They stop the sun from burning the skin and help with blisters." It was another simple, practical statement, but it held a measure of care she could not deny. He had not offered sympathy or soft words. He had offered a solution. It was the way of a man who lived by what worked, not by what sounded pleasant. She realized he was taking care of her, in his own quiet, stoic way. They reached Pine Mesa late the next afternoon. It was larger and more orderly than Dry Creek. The buildings were made of freshly cut lumber, not sun-cracked adobe, and a real church steeple, complete with a bell, pointed a hopeful finger at the sky. A sense of relief washed over Molly. This was a place of order, of law. The Reverend's church was easy to find. It was the cleanest building on the street. Nez dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching rail in front of the town mercantile. "Not the church. We need supplies before we see the Reverend," he said, his eyes scanning the street. Molly nodded, her gaze drifting toward the sheriff's office. On a wooden board next to the door, several notices were posted. One of them was new. It was a piece of paper, stark white against the weathered wood. Even from across the street, she could see the crude, blocky letters at the top. "Wanted." Her blood ran cold. She walked toward it, a terrible certainty growing in her stomach. Nez followed, his expression guarded. There was a poorly drawn sketch of a woman with wild hair and a sharp chin. It looked enough like her to be damning. Below it, the words were stark and vicious. "Molly O'Rourke, for attempted murder by poison, theft, associating with a dangerous savage. $100 reward, issued by the office of Sheriff Ely Vance. Dry Creek. Savage," Molly whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. She looked at Nez. His face was a mask of stone, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, old anger. banked like the coals of a fire. "Boone works fast," Nez said, his voice dangerously quiet. "His lies travel faster," she shot back, tearing her eyes from the poster. Her hope of a fair hearing, of a safe haven, crumbled to dust. Silas Boone had reached out and poisoned this town, too. As she turned away, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows of the alleyway across the street. He was lighting a cigarette. For a moment, the setting sun glinted off the silver object in his hand. It was Hollis Tate. He looked directly at them, took a long drag from his cigarette, and gave them a slow, predatory smile before melting back into the shadows. He was here. He was hunting them. That night, they did not seek shelter in the town. Nez led them to a small, defensible hollow in the rocks a mile outside of Pine Mesa, a place hidden from the main trail. They made a small, smokeless fire of dry juniper wood. The air grew cold quickly as the sun disappeared, and the vast, star-filled sky felt less like a comfort and more like a lonely, endless expanse. They were trapped. Pine Mesa was no sanctuary. It was another cage. Molly stared into the fire. The wanted poster burned into her mind. She felt a familiar, bitter shame rise in her throat. This was what happened when you had no family, no money, no powerful name to protect you. Anyone could call you a thief, a killer, and people would believe it. Nez sat on the other side of the fire, cleaning his rifle. He had not said a word about the poster, but a new tension hummed between them. His simple plan was in ruins. Her trouble was now his in a way he had never intended. The responsibility he felt toward his own people was a heavy weight, and she was an anchor, dragging him deeper into the dangerous currents of the white man's world. Suddenly, a sound cut through the night, the sharp crack of a rifle, followed by the whine of a bullet ricocheting off the rock face high above their camp. It was not a shot meant to hit them. It was a message. "We know where you are." Molly scrambled backward, her heart leaping into her throat. Nez was already moving, kicking dirt onto the fire, extinguishing the small flames in a shower of sparks. He pulled his pistol, his body low to the ground, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their hollow. The night fell silent again, a heavy, listening silence. Then, from the direction of the shot, a small flame flared to life. It was the flick of a lighter. In the brief, golden glow, Molly could see the silhouette of a man. He was too far away to make out his features, but she did not need to. She saw what he held in his hand, a silver cigarette lighter, its surface reflecting the tiny flame. She saw the intricate engravings, the very same ones she had seen in the alley in Dry Creek, in the hand of Silas Boone. It was him. It was Tate, and he was holding the proof. The flame snapped shut, plunging the world back into darkness. But the image remained, seared into Molly's vision. It was not just a threat in the night, it was a key. It was the piece that connected Tate, the robbery, and Silas Boone. It was the truth, and it was in the hands of the man who was hunting them. The rifle shot in the dark was not just a warning. It was a final, undeniable statement. Pine Mesa was a dead end. Every path Silas Boone could not pave with his money, he would salt with his lies. As the echo of the gunshot faded into the immense silence of the high desert, Atsidi Nez made a decision. It was not a choice between two paths forward, but a turn onto a trail that led backward, into the heart of his own world. He did not explain. He simply mounted his horse, waited for Molly to settle behind him, and urged the buckskin away from the direction of any town, any telegraph wire, any semblance of the law they had been seeking. They rode through the night, leaving Tate and his silver lighter behind them. The moon was a cold, silver chip in the black sky, offering just enough light to see the shapes of the mesas and the ghostly forms of yucca plants. Molly, exhausted and numb, did not ask where they were going. She trusted the steady set of his shoulders, the confident way he guided the horse through the darkness as if he were following a road only he could see. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale rose and dusty orange, the landscape began to change. The rock formations grew more ancient and grand, carved by wind and water into cathedrals of stone. They were nearing the canyons the Dain called home, the place where the holy people were said to have first walked the earth. Molly felt a quiet awe settle over her, a feeling that she was entering a place that was older and wiser than the raw, grasping ambition of towns like Dry Creek. The village was not a village in the way she understood the word. There were no straight streets, no false-fronted buildings. Instead, several hogans, the traditional 8-sided dwellings of the Navajo, were scattered across a wide, sunlit valley. They seemed to have grown from the red earth itself, their packed mud walls the same color as the surrounding cliffs. Smoke rose in thin, lazy columns from the smoke holes in their roofs. A flock of sheep, their wool thick and creamy, grazed peacefully, watched over by a pair of dogs and a young boy. As they approached, people emerged from their homes, not with alarm, but with a quiet, watchful curiosity. Their faces were calm, their eyes taking in the stranger on the back of Nez's horse. Nez dismounted and spoke to an older woman in the soft, flowing cadences of his own tongue. He gestured toward Molly, his voice low and even. The woman nodded, her gaze on Molly not unkind, but deeply searching. Nez led the horse toward the largest of the hogans, which stood slightly apart from the others. An old man sat on a woven blanket near the entrance, his long, silver hair tied back with a simple leather thong. His face was a testament to a long life, a beautiful map of wrinkles that spoke of sun and sorrow and laughter. He did not rise, but his eyes, dark and incredibly bright, followed their approach. "Hostine Yazzie," Nez said, his voice holding a deep note of respect. "This is Molly O'Rourke. She is in trouble. The old man, Yazzie," looked at Molly for a long moment. He seemed to see past her trail-worn clothes and the fear that still clung to her like dust. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw and the honesty in her tired eyes. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Trouble comes on the wind," he said, his voice raspy, like stones rubbing together. "It is good to find shelter from the storm. Enter." The inside of the hogan was a single, round room. It was cool and smelled of earth, wood smoke, and something else. A faint, herbal scent like crushed sage. A fire smoldered in a shallow pit in the center of the floor, the smoke rising straight up toward the opening in the roof. Sheepskins were laid out around the fire, and woven blankets with intricate geometric patterns hung on the walls. It was a simple space, but it felt solid, ancient, and deeply peaceful. A woman, perhaps Yazzie's daughter, placed a pot over the fire and began to brew tea. There was no fuss, no hurried questions. There was only the quiet ritual of hospitality. They sat on the sheepskins, and the woman handed them each a small, handleless cup of the steaming, dark liquid. Molly took a sip and had to stop herself from grimacing. It was incredibly bitter, a taste that seemed to scrape the back of her throat. She looked at Nez, who drank his as if it were water. He caught her eye and gave the slightest of nods, an encouragement to drink. She took another, smaller sip. Hostine Yazzie began to speak, his eyes on the flames. He did not speak of their trouble, of Silas Boone or wanted posters. He spoke of the past. He spoke of a time when his people had been forced to leave this land, to walk hundreds of miles to a place called Wildest, the Fort Sumner Reservation. He did not call it the Long Walk. He called it the Road of Returning. They took the sheep first, he said, his gaze distant. Then they burned the corn and the peach trees. They told us we were going to a better place, a place with no memory. He fell silent for a moment, and the only sound was the soft hiss of the fire. But the memory is in the land. When we returned, the land remembered us. The wind still knew our names. We walked the long road back to ourselves. He spoke without anger, only a profound, unshakable sadness. It was not a lesson or a lecture. It was a sharing of a scar. Molly listened, the bitter tea on her tongue, and she understood. She understood the quiet strength in Atsidi Nez, the deep roots that held him to this place. His stillness was not emptiness. It was a deep reservoir of patience, born from a people who had endured the unthinkable and had walked home. She thought of her own journey across a vast ocean, a hungry girl running from a land of famine. And for the first time since she had fled Dry Creek, she felt a sense of connection, a shared understanding of loss that transcended language and skin. She was not just a white woman in a Navajo camp. She was a survivor, sitting with survivors. The peace was broken a few hours later by the arrival of a rider, a young man who had been to the trading post 20 miles to the south. He carried news, and it was bad. He handed Nez a piece of paper, a fresh printing of the wanted poster from Pine Mesa. Silas Boone had not been idle. The bounty had been raised to $200. But it was the new words, added below the old ones, that made Molly's stomach clench with nausea. It now accused her of not only poisoning and theft, but of using witchcraft to bewitch and lure away a Navajo guide from his duties. It was a vicious, calculated lie, designed to turn Nez's own people against him and to paint their flight as something sordid and depraved. It made her not just a criminal, but a source of corruption. Nez read the poster, his face hardening until it looked as if it were carved from the Red Canyon rock. He crumpled the paper in his fist. He was now caught between two worlds, each with its own laws, its own sense of honor. To the white world, he was a savage accomplice. To his own people, this lie could cast a shadow of doubt, suggesting he had abandoned his responsibilities for a wanted woman. His duty was here, to his family, to the promise he had made to earn back their flock. But his honor would not let him abandon this woman to the wolves. He stood and walked out of the hogan, into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. Molly followed him. He stood for a long time, staring out at the vast expanse of the valley, the crumpled poster still clutched in his hand. "There is a United States Marshal at Fort Wingate," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "His name is Ortega. He is said to be an honest man. I could take you there. It is a long ride, and a risk. Boone may have friends even there." He paused, his jaw working. "Or, we find the proof ourselves. We find that silver lighter. We find what Boone stole. We stop running, and we turn to face the wind." It was a choice between two kinds of justice: the flawed, uncertain justice of men with badges, and the raw, dangerous justice of taking the truth into their own hands. Before Molly could answer, Hosteen Yazzie emerged from the hogan. He came to her and held out his hand. Lying on his palm was a bracelet. It was a simple band of silver, inlaid with a single, perfect piece of turquoise, the color of a summer sky. "For the one who has lost her way," Yazzie said, his voice gentle. He took her wrist and fastened the bracelet. The silver was cool against her skin. "The stone knows the path home. It will help you remember." Molly looked down at the vibrant blue stone. It was a gift of impossible kindness, an anchor in a swirling sea of fear and uncertainty. It was a symbol of hope, a promise that there was still a home to be found. A sharp, piercing cry shattered the afternoon stillness. A woman ran from one of the far hogans, her voice a wail of pure terror. Men began to move, their calm expressions replaced with urgency. Nez was instantly alert, his inner conflict forgotten, replaced by the immediate instinct of a protector. "What is it?" he asked a man who ran past. "It is little Ashki," the man said, his face grim. "He was watching the sheep. He is gone. The sheep are scattered." Nez sprinted toward the grazing pasture, Molly close behind him. The scene was one of confusion, the sheep wandering aimlessly, bleeding in distress. The woman, the child's mother, was on her knees, sobbing. Nez knelt by the ground, his eyes scanning the earth, reading the story written in the dust. He saw the small, scuffed prints of a child's moccasins, and beside them, deeper and sharper, were the tracks of a man's boots, heavy, worn down at the heel. White man's boots. His eyes followed the tracks as they led away from the pasture, toward a break in the canyon wall. A few yards along the path, something glinted in the sun. He walked to it and picked it up. It was a small, brass casing from a spent rifle cartridge. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. He had seen casings like it before, near their camp outside Pine Mesa. The last piece of the story fell into place. Hollis Tate had not just been sending a message with his rifle. He had been scouting. And now he had taken a child. The choice was gone. The two paths had merged into one. This was no longer about Molly's name or Boone's stolen money. Tate had brought his violence here, to the heart of Nez's world, and had threatened one of his own. Nez stood up, the brass casing cold in his palm. The look on his face was one Molly had never seen before. The quiet calm was gone, replaced by a deadly, focused intensity. It was the face of a hunter. He looked at the child's mother, then at the tracks leading into the wilderness. "I will bring him back," he said, and it was not a promise. It was a vow. There was no counsel, no debate. The time for words had been burned away by the sight of a child's tracks swallowed by those of a booted man. Atsidi Nez moved with a chilling efficiency. He checked his rifle, filled a water skin, and tied a small pouch of dried meat and corn to his belt. He was preparing for a hunt, his every motion stripped of hesitation. Molly O'Rourke watched him, her heart a cold, tight knot. She saw the women of the village gathered around the boy's mother, their faces a collective mask of grief and fear. She saw the men, their hands clenched, their eyes on Nez, their trust and hope placed entirely on his shoulders. She was the cause of this. The storm had followed her here, and now it had swept up a child. The thought was a shard of glass in her gut. When Nez turned to his horse, she was standing in his way. She had a canvas satchel slung over her shoulder and her own water skin, which one of the women had silently pressed into her hands. In the satchel was a small, heavy object wrapped in cloth. "I am going with you," she said. It was not a question. His dark eyes held hers, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something that looked like pity. "No," he said, his voice flat. "This is not your trail. The man who took him is Hollis Tate," she countered, her voice low and fierce. "He is hunting me. This is my trail whether I want it to be or not. You are a tracker, but you are one man. You will need a second pair of eyes. You will need someone to watch your back. You will slow me down. I will not," she said, her chin jutting out. "I have been on my feet for 18 hours a day in a kitchen hotter than this desert since I was 12 years old. I can keep up, and I will not stay here, a guest in the house of a grieving mother, knowing I brought this trouble to her door." He studied her for another long moment, seeing the iron resolve in her eyes. He saw that she was not speaking from fear or foolishness, but from the same bedrock of honor that guided him. He gave a single, sharp nod. There was no more time for talk. He set a relentless pace, moving not at a run but at a steady, ground-eating trot. The trail was easy to follow at first, the boot prints clear in the sandy soil. Nez moved with his head up, his gaze sweeping from the ground to the horizon and back again, reading the story of their flight in the smallest of signs. A displaced pebble, a broken twig on a sagebrush. Molly focused on putting one foot in front of the other, her breath coming in even puffs, her eyes stinging from the sun's glare. She had been right. She could keep up. The hard years had baked a surprising endurance into her. By midday, the sky began to change. The brilliant, merciless blue started to fade, replaced by a sickly, yellowish haze that grew darker and thicker with each passing minute. The wind, which had been a quiet whisper, began to moan, picking up dust and grit. "A storm," Nez said, his first words in hours. He stopped and scanned the horizon. "A bad one. We need cover." He led them toward a jagged outcropping of rock, a natural wall that might offer some protection. Before they reached it, the storm was upon them. The world dissolved into a howling, roaring chaos of red dust. The sun vanished. The wind shrieked, a physical force that tore at their clothes and tried to rip the breath from their lungs. Visibility was reduced to a few feet. It was like being trapped inside a giant, angry lung, breathing nothing but fire and sand. Nez pulled the buckskin into the lee of the rock face, shielding the animal with his own body. Molly, her face covered with a piece of cloth she had torn from her petticoat, went to the horse's head. She used another strip of cloth to gently bind its eyes, calming the frightened animal, and tried to shield its nostrils. She had seen teamsters do the same during prairie squalls. Her world had been kitchens and saloons, but she had learned by watching, by paying attention to the details of survival that were all around her. She felt a hand on her arm and turned to see Nez beside her, a phantom in the swirling red gloom. He pressed his canteen into her hand. "Drink!" he shouted over the roar of the wind. She shook her head, trying to give it back. He had been pushing harder than she had. He needed it more. He closed her hand around it, his grip like iron. "Drink," he repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. She took a swallow and then moved to his side, holding the canteen to his lips. He drank, his eyes barely visible through the dust, never leaving hers. In that moment, huddled against the storm, they were not a Navajo guide and a fugitive cook. They were two people, alone, fighting the same indifferent fury of nature. When the wind finally began to subside hours later, it left behind a world transformed. The landscape was muted, everything covered in a soft, thick blanket of red dust. The air was still and strangely quiet. The tracks they had been following were gone, completely erased. Molly felt a pang of despair. "They are gone," she whispered. Nez did not answer. He was looking at the rock face beside them. He ran his hand over a series of faint, almost invisible scratches on the stone. "No," he said, "he was here. During the storm. He scraped his gear on the rock." He pointed to a spot on the ground where the dust was slightly disturbed. "He rested here. Then he went that way." He moved on, his certainty a force of nature in itself. Molly followed, her admiration for him a quiet, growing thing. He was not just a tracker, he was a part of this land, and it spoke to him in a language she was only just beginning to understand. They found the camp an hour later, tucked into a narrow, winding gully. There were two men with Hollis Tate. They had a small fire going, and the boy, Ashki, was tied to a stunted juniper tree. He looked small and terrified, but unharmed. Tate and his men were laughing, passing a bottle of whiskey between them. They felt safe, confident that the storm had wiped their trail clean. Nez motioned for Molly to stay back with the horse. He unslung his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. He began to creep forward, using the rocks and shadows for cover. He was a silent, deadly predator closing in on his prey. Molly watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt useless, a spectator in a life-or-death struggle. She looked down at the satchel at her feet. Inside was the one thing she had grabbed from the hogan, her cast-iron skillet. It was small, but heavy and solid. Her weapon, her shield. It felt foolish, but it also felt right. She untied the satchel, her hands moving quietly. Nez had positioned himself on a ledge above the camp. He had a clear shot, but before he could take it, one of the men, perhaps sensing something, stood up and walked away from the fire, directly toward the rocks where Nez was hidden. He was going to walk right into him. Tate and the other man were distracted, arguing over the whiskey bottle. They did not see their companion move into the shadows. Molly saw it. She saw the man draw his pistol as he heard a faint scrape of leather on rock from above. He had found Nez. There was no time to shout a warning. No time for anything but instinct. Molly hefted the skillet in both hands. It was an awkward, heavy thing to throw, but her arms were strong from a lifetime of kneading dough and lifting heavy pots. With a cry that was half rage and half prayer, she threw it. It flew through the air, end over end, a black, clumsy discus of iron. It did not hit the man. It missed him by a good 2 feet, but it struck the rock wall just beside his head with a loud, ringing clang that echoed through the gully like a gunshot. The man flinched, startled by the sudden, bizarre attack, his head whipping toward the sound. That 1 second of distraction was all Nez needed. He dropped from the ledge, landing on the man's back, driving him to the ground. The man's pistol went off, the shot going wild. The camp exploded into chaos. Tate and the other man scrambled for their guns. Nez fired his rifle, the shot kicking up dirt near their feet, forcing them to take cover. He used the terrain, moving from rock to rock, a ghost in the twilight. The gunfight was short and brutal. Nez's movements were precise, his shots carefully aimed. He was not trying to kill them, Molly realized. He was trying to disarm them, to corner them. The second man made a break for it, trying to climb the gully wall. A shot from Nez's rifle hit the rock just above his head, showering him with stone chips. He lost his footing and slid back down, his leg twisting awkwardly beneath him. He lay on the ground, groaning. Hollis Tate was the real danger. He was a professional, and he was cunning. He laid down a suppressing fire, forcing Nez to stay behind a large boulder. Tate started to back away, moving toward the horses, ready to flee. But in his retreat, he forgot about the boy. Ashki, seeing his chance, scrambled to his feet and kicked with all his might at Tate's knee. It was a small, desperate act, but it was enough to make Tate stumble. He turned, his face contorted in a snarl, raising his pistol to strike the child. Nez moved from behind the boulder then, a blur of motion. He did not fire his rifle. He closed the distance in 3 long strides and slammed the butt of the rifle into Tate's wrist. The pistol clattered to the ground. The fight was over. Nez went immediately to the boy, cutting his ropes and speaking to him in low, soothing tones. Ashki threw his arms around Nez's neck, his small body trembling. After a moment, the boy began to speak, his voice a rush of frightened words. He pointed back in the direction they had come. Nez listened, his expression growing intent. He turned to Molly. He says he heard them talking. Nez said Tate was angry. He said Boone was a fool to keep the payroll money so close. He said it was buried in an iron box, near a place called Cedar Wash. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The stolen money, the proof that would clear her name. Molly felt a surge of triumph, but it died in her throat as she saw Nez sway on his feet. He put a hand to his side, and when he drew it away, his fingers were dark with blood. "You are hit," she breathed, rushing to his side. He looked down, almost surprised. "It is a scratch," he said, his voice strained. It was more than a scratch. His shirt was soaked. A bullet had torn a ragged furrow along his ribs. The adrenaline had kept him going, but it was fading fast. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice firm. She pushed him gently until he was sitting with his back against a rock. Her hands were shaking, a fine tremor she could not control, but her mind was clear. She took the whiskey flask and a small sewing kit from his saddlebag. She tore a long, clean strip from the hem of her dress. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice softer now. He just nodded, his jaw tight. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle. He hissed in pain as the alcohol stung the raw flesh, but he did not move. Then, taking a deep breath, she threaded the needle. Her hands trembled, but she forced them to be still. She had stitched up torn sacks of flour and patched countless aprons. This was just a different kind of cloth, a different kind of tear. She took the first stitch, her movements careful and precise. The world narrowed to this one small, intimate act, her hands, tending to his wound, under the vast, silent sky of the high desert. The needle felt alien in Molly's fingers, a slender piece of steel in a hand accustomed to the heft of a knife or the curve of a ladle. But the motion was the same. In, out, pull the thread tight. She focused on the task, on the clean, straight line of stitches she was laying across Atsidi Nez's skin, closing the angry red furrow the bullet had carved. He sat impossibly still, his back against the rock, his breath hissing softly between his teeth with each pull of the thread. He did not complain. He did not move. He simply endured. When she was finished, she tied off the thread and gently patted the wound with a cloth soaked in whiskey. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had passed, burned away by the clean, sharp focus of the work. She had left Tate and his 2 men disarmed, tied securely with their own belts, and a long walk back to any kind of civilization ahead of them. She had also taken Tate's pistol and rifle. It felt right, a small piece of justice reclaimed. Nez looked at her, his eyes dark with pain but clear with a new kind of understanding. "You have a surgeon's hand," he said, his voice raspy. "I have a cook's hand," she corrected him, her voice softer than she intended. "Good for trussing a chicken. I suppose it is the same principle." They made the journey back to the Dane village slowly. Ashki, the small boy, rode on the buckskin in front of Nez. his initial terror replaced by a quiet, hero-worshipping awe. Molly walked beside them, her hand often resting on the horse's flank, as if to steady them all. Nez, weakened by blood loss, swayed in the saddle, but he refused to stop. His duty was to return the child, and his will was a thing of forged iron. Molly found herself watching him, noting the tightness around his mouth, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. She made them stop twice to drink, holding the water skin for him herself, ignoring his flicker of protest. For the first time, he was the one in need of care, and she found a fierce, protective instinct rising in her, an instinct she had not known she possessed. The reunion at the village was a thing of quiet, overwhelming beauty. The boy's mother ran to them, her face a mask of joyous disbelief, and swept her son into her arms, burying her face in his hair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The entire village seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Hosteen Yazzie placed a hand on Nez's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of a debt paid and a duty fulfilled. No grand speeches were made. None were needed. The safe return of a child was a prayer answered, a circle made whole again. They stayed only long enough for Nez to have his wound properly dressed with a poultice of herbs by one of the elder women and to accept a pouch of food. The risk to the village was too great. As long as they remained, they were a beacon for the trouble that was sure to follow. As they prepared to leave, Ashki came to them, his shyness warring with his gratitude. He pressed a small, smooth, gray stone into Molly's hand. He said something in his own language, his eyes wide and serious. Nez translated, his voice low. He says it is a listening stone, to help you hear the truth when it speaks softly. Molly closed her fingers around the stone, its warmth sinking into her palm. She looked at the faces around her, at the quiet dignity and the profound kindness they had shown her. A stranger who had brought violence to their home. Her throat felt tight. "Tell them," she said to Nez, her voice thick. "Tell them I will not forget." He spoke to them, and though she did not understand the words, she understood the gratitude in his tone. Then they were riding again, away from the sanctuary of the valley and back into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness. They rode toward Cedar Wash. It was a dry riverbed, a wide, sandy scar in the earth, littered with smooth stones and bleached pieces of driftwood, cedar and juniper trees, their roots clinging stubbornly to the rocky soil, lined its banks. According to the boy, the box was buried beneath the oldest cedar, the one with a trunk twisted like an old man's spine. It took them an hour to find it. The tree stood alone, a gnarled, ancient sentinel. The ground at its base was hard-packed and covered with shed needles. There was no sign of disturbed earth. He was clever, Nez said, leaning against the tree for support. The ride had taken a toll on him. His face was pale beneath his sun-darkened skin. "Let me," Molly said. She took a flat, sharp-edged rock and began to dig, scraping away the top layer of soil and needles. The work was hard and slow. The ground was stubborn. Her back ached and her hands grew raw, but she did not stop. She was fueled by a desperate, burning need to unearth the truth, to literally dig her good name out of the dirt. After nearly an hour, the rock struck something hard with a dull thud. Her heart leaped. Working together, they cleared the remaining dirt, revealing the dull, rusted top of an iron box. It was heavy, and it took both of them, grunting with effort, to haul it out of the shallow hole. There was no lock, only a simple, heavy latch. Molly's fingers trembled as she worked it open. The lid creaked back, releasing a smell of stale air, damp metal, and something else, a faint, acrid smell like oil. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like old rags, were the contents. The first thing Molly saw was a thick, leather-bound ledger. She lifted it out. The cover was damp and greasy to the touch. It had been wrapped in oilcloth, a crude but effective way to protect it from the damp. She opened it to a random page. It was filled with columns of names, dates, and figures, all written in a cramped, spidery hand. She saw names of businesses in Dry Creek, the names of miners, the name of the Territorial Land Office, and next to each, A sum of money. It was a record of bribes, of debts owed, of a town held in Silas Boone's financial fist. Beneath the ledger was a small, heavy pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. And beside it, lying on a square of velvet, was the source of all her trouble, the silver cigarette lighter. It lay there, gleaming dully in the afternoon light, the intricate engravings seeming to mock her. Seeing it again was like coming face to face with a ghost. It was real. She had not imagined it. This small, elegant object was the key. Nez reached into the box and picked up the ledger, his eyes scanning a page. He pointed to an entry near the bottom. The name listed was Hollis Tate. The amount was $200, and next to the entry, pressed into the greasy paper, was a perfect, dark, oily thumbprint. "The truth," Molly whispered, a wave of dizzying relief washing over her. It was all here, the proof, the weapon they needed. "We have to take this to Fort Wingate, to Marshal Ortega. We will give this to him, and he will arrest Boone. It will all be over." "No," Nez said, his voice quiet but firm. He closed the ledger. "It is not that simple." "What do you mean?" she demanded, the relief souring into confusion. "This is everything we need. It is undeniable proof. Proof is a weapon," he said, looking at her, his eyes serious. "But a weapon is only as good as the man who wields it. Ortega may be an honest man, but a fort is full of men. Tate was a Pinkerton. He has friends. He has eyes and ears in places we cannot see. We walk into that fort, and the first man who sees us could be on Boone's payroll. This box and its truth could disappear before it ever reaches the marshal." A cold dread settled in Molly's stomach. He was right. Boone's corruption was like a root system, spreading unseen beneath the surface. They could not trust the law, because Boone had already bought and paid for his own version of it. A feeling of hopelessness threatened to overwhelm her. She felt like a trapped animal, the walls closing in. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice small. "If we cannot run and we cannot trust the law." What is left? Nez stood, the ledger in his hand. He looked north, in the direction of Dry Creek. "We stop running from the fire," he said. "We build one of our own. We set a trap, and we make the wolf come to us." The plan he laid out was simple, audacious, and terrifying. The next day was market day in Dry Creek, the one day of the week when the town was flooded with ranchers, miners, and families from the surrounding homesteads. It was the one day they could move in a crowd. "We will send a message," he said. "A message for Boone's ears only. We let him know that a certain cook has found a very valuable recipe book, and she is willing to sell it back to its owner, for a price. He will never agree," Molly said, her heart pounding at the thought of returning to that town. "He will not have a choice," Nez countered. "The alternative is letting this ledger get to the territorial capital. That would ruin him. He will come. He will not be able to resist the chance to get this back and silence us for good. He will expose himself. And while he is exposing himself, his men will be putting a rope around my neck. We will not be alone," Nez said. He explained the second part of the plan. He knew a young Navajo boy who worked at the telegraph office in the next county, a boy whose family owed a debt to Hostine Yazzie. He would ride there tonight, send a wire to Marshal Ortega at Fort Wingate. Not a message asking for help, but a message giving him information. It would tell him that a major transaction involving the stolen railroad payroll was going down in Dry Creek on market day. It would be an anonymous tip, one a man like Ortega could not ignore. Molly's mind reeled. It was a desperate gamble. The timing had to be perfect. If Ortega arrived too late, they would be dead. If he arrived too early, Boone would be spooked. She felt the old fear rising in her, the fear of being caught, of being shamed, of being helpless. What if the plan failed? Nez saw the conflict in her eyes. He knew the risk he was asking her to take. He also knew the risk to his own people if Boone and Tate were not stopped. Their violence had already touched the village. He would not allow it to happen again. This was no longer just her fight. It was his. That night, they made a small camp a few miles from the wash. Nez, despite his wound and his exhaustion, prepared to ride to the telegraph station. Before he left, Molly was staring into the fire, the iron box at her feet. "Are you certain this will work?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He did not answer immediately. He checked the cinch on his saddle, his movement slow and pained. "I am certain that it is the only path that is not a dead end," he said finally. He looked at her, his face softened by the firelight. "You are afraid." "Of course I am afraid," she snapped, her fear making her angry. "I am not a gunslinger or a scout. I am a cook. All I ever wanted was a small place of my own, a diner. Nothing fancy, just a place with a clean floor and a hot stove. A place where people could come in, sit down, and get a full belly before they started deciding who was right and who was wrong in the world." She stopped, surprised at her own words, at the raw ache of her simple, battered dream. She expected him to say nothing, to just give one of his stoic nods and ride away, but he did not. He looked at her smudged face and her determined, fearful eyes, and the corner of his mouth twitched. And then, for the first time since she had met him, Atsidi Nez smiled. It was not a big smile. It was a small, quiet, surprising thing, a crack in his stone-like composure. It was a smile that reached his eyes, warming them. And in that moment, the years of hardship and weariness seemed to fall away from his face. "That sounds like a good place," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "A good place to eat." Then he swung himself into the saddle, winced as the movement pulled at his wound, and without another word, he rode off into the darkness, leaving Molly alone with a box full of secrets and the faint, lingering warmth of his impossible smile. The ride back from the telegraph station had taken its toll on Atsidi Nez. The long hours in the saddle had stiffened his wound, and a faint feverish sheen lay on his skin. He had found the boy and sent the message, a single, cryptic sentence crackling across the wires to Fort Wingate, a stone tossed into a pond whose ripples they could only pray would reach the right shore in time. Now, on the eve of their return to Dry Creek, they needed a place to rest. A final moment of quiet before they willingly walked back into the lion's den. He led them to the familiar embrace of the Box Canyon, the same one where they had first stopped after their flight from the town. It felt like a lifetime ago. The towering red walls offered a sense of seclusion, a temporary fortress against the outside world. They made their camp in a deep alcove, sheltered from the wind. As the sun began to set, the sky, which had been a clear, serene blue, turned a bruised, heavy gray. The air grew still and unnaturally cold. A strange pattering sound began. A few scattered taps against the rock, like a nervous finger drumming on a tabletop. Then the sky opened. It was not rain. It was a summer hailstorm, a sudden, violent onslaught of ice. An army of tiny white stones cascaded from the clouds, blanketing the ground in a shimmering, shifting sheet. The temperature plummeted. The hail struck the canyon floor with a frantic drumming, each impact a tiny explosion of cold. They huddled deeper into the alcove, the horse stamping nervously behind them. Nez built a fire with the sagebrush he had gathered, its dry, pungent scent filling the air as the flames caught. The fire was a small circle of warmth and defiance in the midst of the icy assault. Molly sat as close to the fire as she dared, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. But she could not stop shivering. Her dress, worn and thin, offered little protection against the sudden, penetrating cold. The hailstones hissed and spat as they struck the edges of the fire, melting into sizzling drops of water. Each shiver was a deep, bone-jarring tremor that she could not control. Nez watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He sat with his back against the rock wall, his wounded side protected. He had his heavy wool cloak drawn around his shoulders. He watched her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he rose and came to her. He knelt and draped the cloak over her shoulders. The weight of it was a surprise, heavy and solid. It smelled of sage and dust and him. The thick wool was a shield against the cold, and the warmth from his own body still clung to the fabric. She pulled it tighter around herself, the shivering beginning to subside. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the hail. He remained kneeling before her, his face just inches from hers. The firelight carved deep shadows on his features, making his eyes seem darker, deeper. The storm, the fire, the enclosing walls of the canyon, it all seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in a small, intimate world of their own making. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed a stray, damp curl from her cheek. His touch was featherlight, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire or the cloak. He spoke, his voice a low, rough whisper, a confession pulled from the deepest part of him. "I saved the wildest cook in town," he said, his eyes holding hers, "and my nights can't outrun her fire." The words hung in the air between them, simple, direct, and more potent than any flowery poetry. It was an admission of the profound and unsettling effect she had on his stoic, orderly world. She was a blaze he had rescued, only to find she had set his own soul alight. For a moment, Molly was speechless. Her heart, which had been fluttering with cold, now hammered with a different, more powerful rhythm. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, unbidden curve of her lips. She met his intense gaze with a spark of her own, the wit and warmth that were as much a part of her as the knife at her belt. "Then I suppose I will have to cook you something less spicy," she replied, her voice a soft tease, "so you can get some sleep." His answering smile was a rare and precious thing. He settled back on his heels, the tension in his shoulders seeming to ease. The space between them was no longer filled with the urgency of their flight or the grim strategy of their fight. It was filled with a new, quiet understanding. As the hail lessened, eventually quieting to a gentle tapping, they began to talk, not of Silas Boone or Hollis Tate, but of the things that had shaped them. Molly's hand rested on the sheepskin beside his. He covered it with his own. His hand was rough, calloused from reins and rifles, but his touch was gentle. Hers, she thought, must feel strange to him. Strong but softened by years of flour and dough. "My mother," he said, his gaze on the fire. "She taught me to listen, not with my ears, but with my skin, with my feet on the earth." She would say, "The wind knows where the rain is hiding, at Sidi. It knows the paths the deer will take. It knows the secrets of the stone." That is how a tracker learns. Not by looking, but by listening to what the world is telling him. Molly thought of her own childhood, a world away from the patient whisper of the wind. "My mother taught me to listen. Too," she said, her voice soft with memory, "to the sound of bread rising, to the sizzle of onions in a hot pan. That sound tells you when the sugar is starting to caramelize. If you listen, the food tells you what it needs." She smiled a little sadly. "My world was not the wind and the stone. It was a small, hot kitchen in a crowded city, filled with the sound of clanging pots and shouting men, but I learned to listen there. It is how I survived." He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing with hers. He did not speak, but his grip was a silent acknowledgement of their shared past, of two lonely children learning to read the world in their own way, finding their own paths to survival. The peace of the moment was shattered by the unnatural snap of a twig from the mouth of the canyon. Instantly, Nez was transformed. The quiet storyteller vanished, replaced by the warrior. He released her hand, coming to his feet in a single, silent motion, his pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. He pushed Molly back, further into the shadows of the alcove. A figure emerged from the gloom, moving with a hunter's crouch. It was Hollis Tate. He was alone, his face a grim mask of determination, his pistol held at the ready. He had followed the faint scent of their sage fire, a tracker of a different, more malevolent kind. "I knew you would be careless," Tate rasped, his eyes darting around the campsite, trying to pinpoint their location in the shadows. "A fire is a welcome mat for a man like me." Before Nez could respond, a shot rang out, not from Tate, but from above. A second man was perched on the canyon rim, a rifle in his hands. A spray of rock chips exploded from the wall near Nez's head, forcing him back. They were pinned down. Molly's mind raced. They were trapped. She looked around their small camp. The fire, the skillet, still sitting by the flames. a layer of bacon grease from their meager supper congealing in the bottom. An idea, born of 1,000 meals cooked on hot stoves, exploded in her mind. It was desperate. It was mad. It was perfect. While Tate and the man above were focused on Nez, she crawled on her belly to the fire. She grabbed the skillet, its long iron handle blessedly cool. She shoved it directly into the heart of the glowing coals. "What are you doing?" Nez hissed from the darkness. "Making dinner," she whispered back. The grease began to smoke, then to bubble. Tate, seeing the movement, fired a shot in her direction. The bullet whined past her head, striking the canyon wall with a vicious thud. She ignored it, her focus entirely on the skillet. The grease was shimmering now, on the verge of catching fire. Now she screamed. With all her strength, she flung the contents of the skillet in a high arc toward the mouth of the alcove. The superheated grease hit the damp air and instantly ignited. For a moment, a hissing, sputtering sheet of flame filled the narrow space, a curtain of fire and acrid smoke. Tate cried out in surprise and pain, stumbling backward, shielding his eyes from the sudden, blinding flash. The man on the rim was momentarily blinded as well. It was the opening Nez needed. He fired twice, not at Tate, but at the rock wall near him. The ricochets, whining like angry hornets, forced Tate to dive for cover. Nez grabbed Molly's arm. "Run!" They scrambled out of the alcove and ran, deeper into the canyon, leaving Tate and his partner disoriented in the smoke. They did not stop running until their lungs burned and the sounds of shouting faded behind them. They found shelter in a narrow crevice, their bodies pressed together in the cold darkness. Listening, there were no sounds of pursuit. For now, they were safe. Nez was breathing heavily, his hand pressed against his wounded side. "The fire of the wildest cook," he said, his voice a ragged whisper, a thread of humor woven through the exhaustion. As Molly caught her breath, she realized her hand was still clenched around something. In the chaos of the fight, as Tate had stumbled back from the flames, a small leather pouch had fallen from his belt. She had scooped it up without thinking. Now, in the relative safety of the crevice, she opened it. Inside were a few gold coins, heavy and real, and an envelope. It was thick, made of expensive paper. It was sealed on the back with a blob of dark red wax. Pressed into the wax was an ornate, unmistakable seal, a capital B for Boone. It was Tate's bribe money, the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle, the proof that tied the money, the killer, and the rancher together in a neat, damning knot. They now held the truth, sealed with a rich man's pride. The dust of Dry Creek on market day was a living thing. It rose in golden clouds from the hooves of nervous cattle in their pens, puffed up from the wheels of farm wagons, and settled in a fine red powder on every hat brim, every tablecloth, and every hopeful face in the crowded street. The air was a thick stew of smells, horse and leather, frying onions from a food stall, the sharp tang of the blacksmith's forge, and the sweet, cloying scent of cheap perfume from the women of the Ruby Jack, who were enjoying their day off. It was a town at its most vibrant and vulnerable, a chaotic gathering of commerce and gossip, where a man's reputation could be made or broken between the horse trough and the mercantile, into this swirling hub of humanity. Silas Boone moved like a king inspecting his domain. He was dressed in a fine black coat and a clean white shirt, an island of prosperity in a sea of sweat-stained cotton. He clapped men on the back, inquired after their wives, and handed out candies to their children from a pocket, his voice a rich, confident boom that cut through the market's din. He was playing the part of the town's benevolent patriarch, the man who had suffered at the hands of a wicked woman, but who held no grudge, a man who only wanted what was best for his community, the townsfolk, eager for a simple narrative and a powerful man to believe in, accepted his performance with grateful nods. Then, a new scent entered the air. It was warm, sweet, and utterly irresistible, the smell of baked apples and cinnamon. It came from a small, makeshift stall set up near the carpenter's shop, a space no one had claimed. A simple blanket was laid over 2 crates. Upon it was a large woven basket, covered with a clean cloth. Beside the basket stood 2 figures who, by their very presence, brought a sudden, sharp silence to their small corner of the market. It was Atsidi Nez and Molly O'Rourke. Nez stood a little behind her, his arms crossed, his face calm and watchful. He was a silent shadow, a stark contrast to the boisterous life of the market. Molly stood in front of the basket, her face scrubbed clean, her hair pulled back in a severe but tidy bun. She wore the same trail-worn dress, but she had mended its tears and washed it in a stream. She looked tired, but the fear in her eyes had been replaced by a hard, brittle resolve. She was no longer running. She lifted the cloth from the basket, revealing dozens of perfectly browned apple turnovers, their flaky crusts sparkling with a dusting of sugar. The aroma intensified. A declaration of honest, skillful work. A few people, drawn by the smell, began to drift closer. Silas Boone saw them. A flicker of something cold and dangerous passed through his eyes before being replaced by a mask of pitying concern. He started to move toward them, ready to denounce them, to call for the sheriff, but before he could speak, Molly raised her voice. It was not a shout, but it was clear and carried in the dusty air. "Apple turnovers," she announced. "Free of charge. That stopped people. Nothing was free on market day." A crowd began to gather. Their curiosity piqued. "Free," Molly repeated, her gaze sweeping over their faces, meeting their eyes one by one. For anyone who was willing to listen to the truth, she began to hand them out. A grizzled old miner took one, his expression suspicious. A tired-looking woman with 3 small children accepted another, as they bit into the warm, sweet pastry. Their faces softened. This was good food. This was Molly O'Rourke's food, the best in the territory. It was not the food of a poisoner. Boone stood frozen, 100 feet away. This was a form of combat he did not understand. He could fight with money, with lies, with a hired gun, but he did not know how to fight a woman giving away baked goods. He saw the crowd around her growing, saw them listening as she began to speak. "My name is Molly O'Rourke," she said, her voice steady, "and I did not poison anyone. I was accused by that man, Silas Boone, because I saw something I was not meant to see. I saw him with his man, Hollis Tate, planning the robbery of the railroad payroll." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Murmurs spread like wildfire. This was a far more interesting story than a simple case of bad stew. Boone's face turned a deep, furious red. Before he could shout her down, Nez stepped forward. He was not alone. Holding his hand was the small Navajo boy, Ashki. The boy's family, including his mother and hostine Yazzie, stood at the edge of the crowd, their presence a silent, powerful endorsement. The family had agreed. The truth needed a small, clear voice. "This boy is named Ashki," Nez said, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. "A few days ago, he was taken from his family. The man who took him was Hollis Tate. The man who paid Hollis Tate was Silas Boone." Nez knelt and spoke to the boy in their own language. Ashki, though clearly frightened to be the center of so many staring faces, stood up straight. He looked at the crowd and began to speak, his child's voice high and clear. Nez translated, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. "He says the man with the gun, the one they called Tate, took him." Nez translated, "He says he was scared, but he listened. He heard the men talking about money, a lot of money, buried in an iron box. He heard them say the name Boone many times." The crowd was rapt. The sight of the small, earnest child telling his story was more powerful than any accusation Molly could have made. They looked from the boy to Silas Boone, and, for the first time, they saw not a benefactor, but a bully. The mask was beginning to crack. Boone knew he had lost control. He gave a subtle, sharp nod to someone in the crowd. It was Hollis Tate. He had been lurking near the saloon, a predator waiting for a signal. He drew his pistol, not to shoot anyone, but to create chaos. He fired a single shot into the air. The market exploded. People screamed. Horses reared, pulling at their tethers. Tables of goods were overturned. The crowd around Molly and Nez scattered, diving for cover. It was the stampede of fear Boone had wanted. But a new voice cut through the pandemonium. A voice of pure, cold authority. Federal Marshal. Drop the weapon. A tall, lean man with a grim face and a silver star on his vest stepped out from behind a wagon. He held a Colt revolver leveled at Tate. Beside him was a younger, broad-shouldered deputy. It was Marshal Ortega. The telegram had arrived. Tate hesitated, his eyes darting from the marshal to Boone, looking for an order. At that moment, another figure moved. A local deputy named Finch. He was a Weasley man who had always been in Boone's pocket. "I will secure the evidence," Marshal Finch shouted, playing the part of a helpful officer. He lunged for the iron box, which Molly had placed at her feet. He snatched the oily ledger from inside, but instead of handing it to Ortega, he tripped, stumbling sideways with a theatrical cry. He fell directly into the open door of the blacksmith's forge, where a fire roared, heating a piece of iron to a bright orange. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the ledger into the heart of the flames. The oilcloth that had protected the ledger now condemned it. It caught fire instantly, erupting in a whoosh of greasy, black smoke. The truth, the names, the numbers. The oily thumbprint of Hollis Tate. It all curled into black, brittle ash. Molly cried out, a sound of pure despair. She saw it all happening in a horrifying, slow-motion tableau, the marshal shouting, Tate raising his gun again, and the proof of her innocence being consumed by fire. Ortega was a professional. He saw the evidence was lost, but the immediate threat was not. He and his deputy moved on Tate, their guns unwavering. Tate, seeing Boone making a retreat into the chaos, knew the game was up. He threw his gun down in disgust. Ortega's deputy kicked it away and slapped iron cuffs on his wrists. The whole explosive encounter was over in less than a minute. Hollis Tate was in custody, but Silas Boone was gone. In the confusion, he had melted back into the panicked crowd, snatching the half-burned, smoldering remains of the ledger as he went. The market was a wreck. People were slowly picking themselves up, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. The moment of truth had been shattered, leaving only questions. Deputy Finch was profusely apologizing to Marshal Ortega, claiming he had lost his footing in the panic. Ortega looked at the man with cold, knowing eyes, but he had no proof. Molly stood amidst the wreckage, her basket of turnovers overturned, the sweet pastries crushed and dirty in the dust. She stared at the blacksmith's forge, at the last wisps of foul-smelling smoke rising from the coals. It was over. They had lost. All that risk, all that hope, had turned to ash. A wave of utter hopelessness washed over her, so powerful it made her knees weak. She felt a hand on her arm. It was Nez. He stood beside her, his face grim but his eyes clear. He had seen it all, too. But he had not seen despair. He had seen a tactic. He leaned close, his voice a low, steady anchor in her sea of disappointment. He took the bait. Nez said, but he did not get the prize. She looked at him, uncomprehending. He burned it. Nez, it is all gone. No, he said, his gaze fixed on the street where Boone had vanished. That was not the real ledger. It was a copy I made last night. Pages torn from an old book, rubbed with grease and dirt. The real book, the real truth, is still safe. He paused, then looked down at her, his eyes holding a new, hard light. It is in the one place he would think it was safe. It is in a second cache, in his own house, on his ranch. He looked back toward the open country, the lion's den. Now, we must go and get it. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky, offering little light and no comfort. The Boone Ranch was a dark stain on the land, a sprawling collection of buildings that radiated a quiet menace. After the chaos of the market, Atsidi Nez and Molly O'Rourke had met with Marshal Ortega on a dusty road miles from Dry Creek. There, with the last light of day fading, Nez had laid out the truth. He spoke of the real ledger, of Silas Boone's arrogance, and of the trap that needed to be sprung. Ortega, a man whose face seemed carved from granite, had listened without interruption. He had looked at the earnest, desperate faces of the cook and the Navajo guide, and he had looked at his own local deputy, Finch, who could not quite meet his gaze. He had seen enough corruption in his years to recognize its smell. He agreed to the plan. He and his federal deputy, a young, stout man named Richards, would create a diversion at the far end of the property, a supposed search for cattle rustlers. While Nez and Molly went in for the proof, it was a dangerous, unsanctioned move. But Ortega knew that sometimes the law had to be pursued outside the lines drawn by crooked men. Now, hours later, Nez and Molly lay on their bellies on a low ridge overlooking the ranch. The main house was dark, save for a single lamp burning in a downstairs window. A few guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements lazy and predictable. "The office is there," Nez whispered, pointing to the lit window. "But the main doors will be watched. The wine cellar is on the north side. The lock is old. They moved like shadows, flitting from one patch of darkness to the next. The air in the stables was warm and thick with the familiar, comforting smells of hay and horse. It was a scent from a different, simpler life, and it felt like a mockery now. They reached the cellar door, a heavy oak structure set into the stone foundation of the house. The lock was a large, rusty iron thing. Molly pulled a long, slender nail from a leather pouch at her waist. She had spent a patient hour at the blacksmith's forge in Dry Creek, heating and hammering it, shaping the tip into a thin, angled probe. It was a skill learned in a life she did not speak of, a life of locked pantries and hungry nights. Her fingers, deft and sure, probed the lock's mechanism. It was a stubborn, gritty process. For a full minute, the only sounds were the distant call of a nightbird and the faint, rhythmic scrape and click of metal on metal. Then, with a final, satisfying snap, the tumblers gave way. The door was open. "The wind tower," Nez murmured. "I need to see the whole board before we move the pieces." He left her at the door and melted back into the night. Molly watched him go, then took a deep breath and slipped into the cool, musty darkness of the wine cellar. The air smelled of damp earth and aging wine. She made her way through the maze of barrels and racks, her hand trailing along the cold stone wall, until she found the stairs leading up into the house. Meanwhile, Nez reached the base of the tall, skeletal wind tower that stood in the center of the yard. It was the highest point on the ranch, a rickety structure of wood and iron that groaned with every gust of wind. The climb was perilous. The wooden rungs were worn smooth and slick with dew. He moved with a climber's grace, his movements fluid and silent, until he was perched at the very top, a dark silhouette against the star-scattered sky. From here, he could see everything. He saw the two guards making their slow, circular patrol. He saw the light in Boone's office. He saw the faint, distant flicker of a lantern where Ortega and Richards were creating their diversion. And he saw Molly, a ghost of movement, as she emerged from the cellar into a hallway in the main house. She moved through the sleeping house, a place of wealth and cruelty. The floors were polished wood, the walls hung with tapestries. It was a world away from her steaming kitchen or the simple, earthen hogans of Nez's people. Each creak of the floorboards under her worn boots was a thunderclap in the silence. She reached the office. The door was unlocked. The room was a testament to Silas Boone's ego. A massive desk dominated the space, and the walls were lined with books he had likely never read. The air smelled of stale cigar smoke and whiskey. Molly moved to the far corner of the room, to a large bearskin rug spread on the floor. She remembered Nez's description, a detail gleaned from a drunken ranch hand years ago. She knelt and ran her hands over the floorboards beneath the rug. She found it almost immediately, a board whose edges were not flush with the others. Using the tip of her paring knife, she pried it up. Beneath it lay a small, black iron safe, bolted to the floor joists. It was a formidable sight, but as she examined it, she saw it was an older model. She had seen one like it before. She went to the desk. Men like Boone were arrogant. They believed their fortresses were impenetrable. She pulled open the top drawer. It was filled with papers. Beneath them, tucked into a corner, was a small brass key. Her hands shook as she fit the key into the lock. It turned with a well-oiled click. She swung the heavy door open, and there it was, the real ledger, its leather cover cool and solid beneath her fingers. Beside it was a sheaf of letters, and on top was a folded envelope, sealed with the territorial judge's official stamp. It was a letter of instruction, a bribe laid out in cold, clear terms, and beneath that, a hand-drawn map detailing the route of a wagon carrying gold from the Morning Star mine, a plan for the next robbery. She had it all. She had the truth, hard and heavy in her hands. From his perch on the wind tower, Nez saw a second light appear in the house, moving down the main hallway. Someone was awake. He let out a low, soft whistle, the sound of a nightjar, their prearranged signal for danger. Molly heard it. She shoved the ledger and the letters into her canvas satchel and scrambled out of the office, pulling the door shut behind her. As she ran down the hall, a door opened, and a large, sleep-fuddled man in his long john stepped out, a pistol in his hand. It was Boone's foreman. His eyes widened in recognition. "You!" he bellowed. The house erupted. A dog began to bark furiously outside. Lights flared to life in the bunkhouse. The trap had been sprung. Molly did not hesitate. She ran, bursting through the back door of the house and out into the main yard. The recent rains had turned the ground into a slick, ankle-deep morass of mud. She could hear the foreman shouting behind her, the sound of other men joining the chase. Nez was already climbing down the tower, his descent a controlled fall. He landed softly on the ground as two ranch hands ran toward Molly, cutting off her escape. One of the men lunged for her. She dodged, her feet slipping in the mud. Her eyes darted around, looking for a weapon, for any advantage. She saw a long, thick leather harness rein hanging from a hook on the stable wall. She grabbed it. The man came at her again, a grin on his face, enjoying the chase. As he lunged, Molly swung the heavy rein in a low, fast arc, just as she would snap a wet towel to sting a lazy kitchen hand. The thick leather strap wrapped around his ankles. She pulled hard. The man's feet shot out from under him, and he went down with a great, squelching splash, his face planting in the mud. The second man stared in disbelief for a second, and that second was all Nez needed. He slammed into the man's side, a silent, unstoppable force, driving him to the ground. But now a larger threat emerged from the house. Silas Boone himself, a massive figure in a nightshirt, a heavy shotgun in his hands. He saw Nez and let out a roar of pure animal rage. He charged, not bothering to raise the shotgun, but using it like a club. Nez sidestepped the wild swing, and Boone, overbalanced, stumbled past him. Nez moved in, his hands empty. This was personal. Boone dropped the shotgun and pulled a large, wicked-looking Bowie knife. He came at Nez, his face a mask of hate. "Savage!" Boone spat, lunging. "I will gut you myself." Nez moved like water, flowing around the bigger man's clumsy attacks. The moonlight glinted on the blade as it slashed through the air. Nez drew a knife of his own from a sheath on his back. It was not a fighting knife. The handle was simple wood, the blade shaped like a willow leaf. It was his nilchi, his wind knife, a tool for ceremony, not for killing. Boone lunged again. Nez parried the blow with his forearm, the big knife scraping his skin. For a breathtaking moment, the two men were locked together, chest to chest. Nez had a clear opening. The tip of his ceremonial blade was pressed against the soft flesh under Boone's ribs. He could end it. He could end the man who had threatened his people, who had tried to destroy Molly, who had poisoned the very land with his greed. The temptation was a hot, bitter taste in his mouth. He saw the flicker of fear in Boone's eyes, and he pulled back. He reversed the knife in his hand and slammed the heavy wooden pommel into the side of Boone's head. There was a dull, sickening thud, and Boone's eyes rolled back. The big man collapsed into the mud like a felled ox, unconscious but alive. Justice, not vengeance. "Nez," it was Molly's voice, sharp with alarm. He turned. Marshal Ortega and his deputy were running toward them from the edge of the property, their guns drawn. The diversion was over. They were coming to help, but Boone was tougher than he looked. His eyes fluttered open. With a guttural groan, he rolled over and his hand found the shotgun lying in the mud. He raised it, his movement sluggish, and fired a single, unaimed blast into the night. Marshal Ortega cried out and fell, clutching his leg, in the instant of shock and confusion, as Deputy Richards rushed to his fallen commander. Silas Boone scrambled to his feet. He staggered toward the stables, grabbed the reins of a saddled horse, and hauled himself onto its back. He kicked the animal into a desperate gallop, not toward the town, but toward the dark, jagged maw of Black Gulch, a notorious maze of canyons where the law rarely ventured. Nez and Molly ran to Ortega's side. The marshal was pale, his face beaded with sweat, a dark stain spreading across his trouser leg. Richards was trying to apply a tourniquet. "Go!" Ortega grunted, his voice tight with pain. He looked at Nez, his eyes blazing with an unyielding fire. He cannot get away, not with that ledger. With a trembling hand, Ortega unpinned the silver star from his vest. He pressed it into Nez's hand. The metal was heavy, its points sharp against his palm. "You are the law now," Ortega gasped, his voice fading. "Bring them to justice. For me." The silver star felt like a block of ice in that seedy Nez's palm. Then a burning coal. It was a weight of impossible substance, a symbol of a world whose laws had so often been used as a weapon against his people. Now, it was his, a tool, a burden, a promise made to a bleeding man. There was no time for contemplation. Silas Boone was a wounded animal, escaping into the one place he might feel safe, the twisted, lawless labyrinth of Black Gulch. Deputy Richards, his young face pale but determined, knelt beside his marshal. "I have to get him back to town, to a doctor," he said, his voice strained. "I cannot leave him." "Go," Nez said. He pinned the star to his own worn leather vest. It looked strange and out of place, a piece of the white man's world laid over the quiet earth tones of his own. "We will handle Boone." He and Molly took two of the best horses from Boone's own stable. There was a grim justice in that. As they rode, the air grew heavy and humid, the smell of rain thick on the wind. The first drops, fat and cold, began to fall as they reached the mouth of the gulch, a dark, jagged scar in the earth. The rain hissed against the hot rock, turning the dust to a slick, treacherous paste. "The rain will wash away his tracks," Molly shouted over the rising wind. "He has only one path," Nez shouted back, his eyes fixed on the narrow entrance. "And it is a trap for a man in a hurry." They plunged into the darkness of the gulch. The walls rose up on either side, sheer cliffs of black, rain-slicked rock that seemed to lean in, eager to swallow them. The chase was a nightmare of stumbling horses and sliding stones. Boone was desperate, pushing his horse recklessly through the narrow, twisting passages. Nez was patient, a relentless pursuer, his senses alive to the sounds and feelings of the canyon. He was no longer just tracking a man. He was tracking the fear that drove him. The rain intensified, a torrential downpour that turned the floor of the canyon into a shallow, fast-moving river. Visibility was almost nothing. It was a race through a world of roaring water and echoing darkness. They rounded a sharp bend and saw a sight that made Molly's heart leap. A small herd of wild mustangs, perhaps a dozen of them, were huddled in a rock shelter, their coats dark with rain, their eyes wide with fear. An idea, wild and improbable, sparked in Molly's mind. She was not a rider like Nez, not a fighter, but she knew chaos. She had commanded it every day in a hot, crowded kitchen. The horses, she yelled, pointing. "Get ahead of them, drive them forward." Nez understood instantly. It was a wild gamble, but in this place, caution was a slower form of death. He spurred his horse, skirting the terrified herd, while Molly, letting out a sharp, piercing cry, rode directly toward them, waving her arms. The mustangs, already spooked by the storm, bolted. They surged forward, a living wave of panicked muscle and thundering hooves. Directly down the narrow canyon pass, they became a moving screen. The thunder of their passage was deafening, the spray of mud and water a blinding curtain. Behind this chaotic vanguard, Nez and Molly were able to close the distance. Boone, hearing the terrifying sound of a stampede behind him, pushed his horse even harder. The chase ended where the canyon floor abruptly fell away, ending in a high, narrow ledge that overlooked a churning, muddy river 50 feet below. Boone was trapped. He reined in his horse, the animal rearing in terror at the edge of the cliff. He turned, his face a mask of desperation and fury, as the mustangs, seeing the open space ahead, veered off and scattered into a side canyon. Nez and Molly were there, blocking the only escape. Boone slid from his horse, a pistol appearing in his hand. He was soaked, his fine nightshirt plastered to his body, but he stood his ground, a cornered beast ready for its final fight. "You!" he spat, his eyes fixed on Nez. "I should have known a savage would not know when to quit." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It does not matter. You think that Tin Star makes you a lawman? You cannot testify against me. No court in this territory will hear the word of an Indian against a white man. Your word is worthless. You are worthless." Nez dismounted slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his head, and water dripped from the brim of his hat. He did not look at the star on his chest. He looked at Silas Boone. "The land has its own laws," Nez said, his voice quiet but carrying over the roar of the water below. "It saw what you did. The stones remember. The wind heard your lies, and they testify against you." Enraged by the quiet dignity that he could not break, Boone lunged. He was a bull of a man, and he charged across the slippery rock, intending to overwhelm Nez with brute force. The two men met with a grunt. It was not a fight of skill, but a desperate, brutal struggle on the edge of oblivion. They slipped and slid on the slick stone, their hands locked, each trying to hurl the other over the edge. Boone had size and strength. Nez had speed and a lifetime of balance learned on treacherous ground. Molly watched, her heart in her throat. The rifle she had taken from Boone's ranch clutched in her hands. She could not get a clear shot. They were a tangled, struggling mass of limbs. Boone broke free for a moment and slammed his fist into Nez's wounded side. Nez gasped, a jolt of pure agony shooting through him. He stumbled back, his heels skidding on the very edge of the precipice. Boone saw his chance. He raised his pistol. The barrel pointed directly at Nez's chest. There was no time to think. Molly raised the rifle. The rain was in her eyes. Her hands were numb with cold, but she held it steady. She aimed not for the man, but for the gun. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The shot was a flat, sharp crack in the storm. For a heart-stopping second, she thought she had missed. Then she saw Boone's pistol spin out of his hand, clattering against the rocks. The force of the impact, the shock of it, made him lose his already precarious footing. He cried out, a sound of pure terror, as his feet slipped out from under him. He fell backward, his arms flailing, and slid over the edge of the cliff, but he did not fall. His hand, in a last, desperate grasp, caught hold of a small, gnarled root sticking out from the cliff face. He dangled there, his full weight held by that one slim anchor, the flooded river raging below him. Nez stood over him, breathing heavily, his hand pressed to his side. He looked down at the man who had tried to have Molly hanged, who had kidnapped a child, who had tried to kill him. He saw the terror in Boone's eyes, the pathetic pleading of a tyrant stripped of all his power. Vengeance was a simple, easy thing. All he had to do was nothing. Molly ran to his side. "Nez," she breathed, her voice shaking. He looked from Boone's face to hers, then down at the star on his chest. He was not a killer. He was the law. He knelt, the slick rock treacherous beneath him, and reached down. He grabbed Silas Boone's thick wrist. With a great, grunting effort, his muscles screaming in protest, he hauled the heavy man back up, over the edge, and onto the safety of the ledge. Boone lay there, sobbing and shivering, a broken, pathetic heap in the mud. The trial was held in the open air. In the center of the Dry Creek Market Square, the traveling judge, a man named Marcus Ford, who had been summoned by Ortega's earlier telegram, had arrived that morning. He was a stern, hawk-nosed man with eyes that missed nothing. He had heard Ortega's story, had seen the ledger, and had agreed that this was a matter for the public record. The entire town had gathered. They stood in a wide, silent circle, their faces a mixture of shame, guilt, and a fierce, burning curiosity. This was their court, their judgment. Hollis Tate was brought from the town's single jail cell, his arrogance replaced by a sullen, resentful silence. Silas Boone, wrapped in a blanket, his face slack with defeat, was placed beside him. Judge Ford convened his court from the back of a flatbed wagon. The evidence was presented, one damning piece after another. Molly stood before the town and told her story, her voice clear and strong. Ashki, holding his mother's hand, pointed a small, steady finger at Tate and Boone. Nez translated his simple, unwavering account. The silver cigarette lighter was presented, then the sealed envelope with the judge's own wax seal, proving the attempted bribe. And then, Nez, wearing the marshal's star, produced the real ledger. He opened it and handed it to Judge Ford. A hushed murmur went through the crowd as the judge read a few of the entries aloud, names they all knew, debts and payments that had held their town in a grip of fear. The verdict, when it came, was an affirmation of all they had seen. Guilty, on all counts, armed robbery, kidnapping, conspiracy, corruption of public officials. The sentence was 20 years of hard labor in the federal prison. Justice, clean and undeniable, had been served under the open sky, for all to see. It had not mattered that the star witness was a woman with a reputation, or that the man who wore the star was a Navajo. The truth had its own authority. As the deputy led the two condemned men away, the crowd was silent for a long moment. They looked at Molly, standing alone by the wagon. Then one man, a miner whose face she vaguely recognized, stepped forward. He took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We were wrong. I'm sorry." Then a woman, the one with the 3 small children, stepped forward. "We are all sorry. Miss O'Rourke," she said softly. More people murmured their agreement. It was not a cheer or a celebration. It was a quiet, profound apology. Amending. Molly just nodded, too weary and overwhelmed to speak. She looked for Nez. He was not in the center of things. He was standing at the far edge of the crowd, by himself, watching. He had already taken off the star. He was just a man again, standing quietly on the land, as patient and enduring as the wind that was beginning to blow the dust from the street. The raw, cathartic energy of the trial faded, leaving behind the quiet, ordinary dust of a Dry Creek afternoon. The town, having faced its own reflection in the mirror of Boone's corruption, seemed to breathe a different air, cleaner and more tentative. The healing began, as it often does, not with grand gestures, but with small, quiet acts. Marshal Ortega did not die. He was a man forged of the same tough, unyielding material as the territory he patrolled. The town's doctor, a man whose hands were more accustomed to whiskey tremors than shotgun wounds, managed to pull the pellets from his leg. They carted him by wagon to a proper army surgeon at the nearest fort, where, after a week of foul-tempered convalescence, he was declared to be on the mend. Before he left, he summoned Nez and Molly to his bedside. He looked from one to the other, his gaze lingering on the empty place on his vest where his star had been. Nez had given it back the moment the judge's gavel had fallen, the weight of it a thing he was glad to be rid of. "The territorial prosecutor will want to talk to you both," Ortega said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Boone's ledger points to a whole rat's nest of corruption. Clear up to the Capitol. Testifying could be dangerous. But I wanted you to know. The United States Marshal Service will offer full protection. You will have a safe escort, a new place to live if you want it. You will be under our care." Molly looked at Nez. A few weeks ago, the offer of a new life, a clean slate somewhere far away, would have been a dream. Now, the thought of leaving this harsh, beautiful, unforgiving land felt like another kind of exile. She had not just been running from a false accusation. She had been running toward a home she had not known she was looking for. "Thank you, Marshal," she said, her voice clear. "But I believe I have found my place right here." Nez simply nodded his agreement. Their paths were no longer about escape. They were about building. And build she did. The reward for the capture of Boone and Tate was substantial. A small fortune by the standards of Dry Creek. Molly took her share and, with the town's silent, shame-faced approval, bought the abandoned diner at the end of the street. The place was a wreck, its windows clouded with grime, its interior a mausoleum of dust and forgotten hopes. But Molly saw not what it was, but what it could be. She worked from dawn until long after dusk, her energy a fierce, joyful thing. She hired the town carpenter to fix the roof and replace the floorboards. She scrubbed the walls, reglazed the windows, and painted a simple, welcoming sign over the door, "Sage Iron." On the day she opened, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Would anyone come with the stain of the accusation, however false, still linger? The question was answered just after sunrise. A line began to form, a quiet, shuffling queue of miners and ranchers, mothers and their children, the very people who had once been whipped into a frenzy against her. They came not with demands, but with a humble, hungry respect. The first thing on the menu was apple turnovers, made from the same recipe, served warm from the new, gleaming stove she had bought. She handed them out, her movements sure and graceful, her smile genuine. It was more than food. It was an act of grace, an offering of forgiveness that the town accepted with every delicious, flaky bite. Her dream was no longer a distant hope. It was a reality of clean countertops, the smell of fresh coffee, and the quiet satisfaction of a full house. Atsidi Nez took his half of the reward and rode north, back toward the canyons of his people. He did not buy trinkets or whiskey. He did not buy a piece of land in the white man's world. He bought sheep, a whole new flock, 200 strong, their wool thick and their bloodline sturdy. He drove them himself, a long, slow journey back to the valley, his heart lighter with every step, the sight of the flock spreading out across the familiar grazing lands. The quiet joy on the faces of his kin was a richer payment than any gold coin. But he did not stop there. With the remaining money, he hired a team of men and engineers from the railroad. They came with wagons of pipe and cement, and for a month, they worked under his direction, building a deep, stone-lined cistern and a series of troughs that would catch and hold the precious seasonal rain. He was not just restoring what was lost, he was providing for the future, ensuring that the next drought would not be so cruel. He had fulfilled his duty. He had honored his family. One cool autumn evening, a month after he had left, he rode back into Dry Creek. The town was quieter now, settling into a new, more honest version of itself. He did not go to the saloon or the mercantile. He walked to the end of the street, to the warm, golden light spilling from the windows of Sage Iron. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching. The diner was full, the air humming with quiet conversation and the clatter of forks on plates. Molly moved through it all, a calm, steady presence at the center of her small universe. She refilled coffee cups, delivered plates of steak and potatoes, and shared a laugh with the blacksmith. She looked tired, but it was a good kind of tired. She looked happy. She looked home. When she saw him, her face broke into a smile that lit up the entire room. She wiped her hands on her apron and came to him. "You are back," she said, her voice soft. "The sheep are home," he replied simply. Later, after the last customer had gone and the doors were locked, he was still there. He had not just come to visit. He had noticed a section of the back wall where she needed more shelving for her supplies. Without being asked, he had found a stack of fresh pine boards left by the carpenter and had set to work. The only sounds in the diner were the rhythmic rasp of his saw and the gentle clink of Molly washing the last of the dishes. She watched him work, his movements as economical and purposeful as ever. He was a man who spoke with his hands, with his actions. He was building a part of her home, fitting himself into the structure of her new life. When he had finished, he stood back to admire the clean, sturdy shelves. They were perfect. "They will hold," he said. "I know they will," she answered. She had finished her work and was drying her hands. The diner was clean and quiet, smelling of coffee and soap. The night was a deep, silent blue outside the windows. "You should stay for supper," she said, her voice casual. But her heart was beating a little faster. He turned to look at her, a long, considering look. A faint, slow smile touched his lips, the same one she had seen by the fire in the canyon. It was a smile that promised not wild passion, but a deep and abiding warmth. "I will stay," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He looked toward the sink, where her heavy, cast-iron skillet, the one she had retrieved from the saloon, sat waiting, "I will stay," to wash the skillet. And she laughed, a full, happy sound that filled the quiet space. It was not a grand promise of forever, not a declaration of undying love shouted from the rooftops. It was something smaller and infinitely more real. It was a promise of shared work, of quiet companionship, of being there for the simple, everyday tasks that make up a life. It was a promise to help carry the load. They did not speak of the future. They chose, instead, to live in the quiet grace of the present. Later that night, as the last lamp was extinguished, the scent of sage from the nearby hills drifted in through an open window, mingling with the smell of iron and old wood. A gentle wind whispered through the blades of the town's windmill, a sound like a steady, peaceful breath. The fire she had brought to his life, the wild, untamable flame that had tested them and forged them, was still there. But now, it was not a thing that burned or consumed. It was the warm, steady, and enduring glow of a hearth, a light to guide them home, every single day. Thank you for being a part of this journey through the dust and dreams of the West. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to help share our story with more listeners.